All right, so picture this. It's March 1919. The Great War, the war to end all wars, has been over for 4 long months. You'd think the danger was past, right? Well, not for a group of Canadian soldiers. They survived the trenches, only to be killed at a military camp in North Wales. This is the story of the Kinmel Park riots, and it's a story that was buried for a very long time.
And that's the thing that just doesn't make sense, right? The war was over. These guys were heroes. They were just waiting to go home. So how on earth did things go so wrong that it ended in bloodshed?
5. That's the number. 5 Canadian soldiers lost their lives in these riots. And listen, this wasn't on the Western Front in the heat of battle. This was in March 1919, months after the armistice, on what should have been friendly soil. And this is the most shocking part of all. They weren't killed by the enemy. They were killed in a clash with their own side. Okay, so how do you even begin to explain something like that? Well, if you're the authorities, you come up with a story. And the one they crafted was, let's just say, very simple, very convenient, and it pointed the finger at a very specific enemy. Now, to really get why their story worked, you have to understand the year. 1919. This was the peak of the Red Scare. There was this massive, widespread panic about communism and workers' revolutions. So the government tapped right into that fear. They framed the riots not as their own failure, but as some kind of external contagion, an infection from outside. And they got really specific with it. The official story wasn't just some vague unrest. Oh no, it was a planned revolution, led by so-called Bolshevik agitators. And every good story needs a villain, right? They found the perfect scapegoat in a Russian-born soldier named William Tarasevich. They claimed he was waving a red flag, shouting Bolshevik slogans. I mean, it was the perfect narrative to get military command completely off the hook. And publicly? Oh, they totally downplayed it. I mean, listen to this official statement. It calls a deadly riot an incident. Just an incident that was regretted. The message they were sending was crystal clear. Hey, our Canadian troops are the picture of discipline. This was just a tiny blip, a freak thing, caused by a few radicals. Nothing to see here. Right, but the soldiers who were actually in that camp, they told a very, very different story. For them, this had nothing to do with Bolsheviks or revolution. It was about something way more personal. It was about a deep, bitter feeling of being betrayed. So let's just lay it out. You've got 2 completely competing stories. The government says organized radical plot. The soldiers say spontaneous protest born of frustration. The government blames outside agitators. The soldiers blame their own leadership for neglect. So let's get into the soldiers' side of things. What was this betrayal all about? Okay, so the first betrayal was all about getting home. There was this secret, unwritten rule, first over, first back. If you'd been there since the beginning, you should be on the first boat home. Makes sense, right? But then they start hearing that their ships are canceled. And worse, that new guys, recent conscripts, are getting sent home before the veterans who had served since 1914. And of course, rumors started flying. Maybe the ships were being used for U.S. troops or for some secret mission in Russia. With absolutely no information coming from the officers, that frustration just boiled over into pure rage. And as if that wasn't bad enough, you have the living conditions. The men literally called it landscapes of misery. I mean, they were shoved into these freezing huts, way over capacity, with no coal for heat in the middle of a bitter winter. Then you've got the Spanish flu just tearing through the camp, killing men who had somehow survived years of war. And the food, they called it pig's will. Seriously, this was no hero's welcome home. It was an absolute nightmare. So on top of all that misery, guess what? They weren't even getting paid. Lost paperwork, bureaucracy, a lot of these guys hadn't seen a dime in over a month. And to make it even worse, the little makeshift shops just outside the camp, this place they called Tin Town, were jacking up the prices on everything, totally taking advantage of them. At this point, it feels less like neglect and more like straight-up exploitation. So let's recap. You've got broken promises, you've got just awful living conditions, and you've got guys who are flat broke. All that anger and resentment was just simmering, you know? It was a powder keg just waiting for a spark. And on March 4th, 1919, it exploded. So here's a play-by-play of how it all went down. It kicks off on the night of March 4th with looting. The men start breaking into the canteens and shops, taking food, booze, tobacco, stuff they felt they were owed. What's really interesting, though, is they made a point to leave the Salvation Army canteen alone. They actually respected those folks. But by the next morning, the officers had had enough. They organized troops who were still loyal to put an end to it. And by the afternoon, you have this awful confrontation, a mob of rioters facing off against armed soldiers. It wasn't a protest anymore, it was a battle, with gunfire and bayonet charges. And when it was all over, when the violence was finally put down, 28 soldiers were wounded. And 5 were dead. And yeah, Sabur Tarasevich, the guy the government painted as a Bolshevik ringleader, was one of them. These are the men who survived a world war, only to be killed in a camp, just waiting to get home. You know, if you look at the gravestone of one of the men, Corporal Joseph Young, the inscription it just hits you. It captures all the heartbreak and confusion of this whole thing. It's a plea, really. A plea to make sense of something that feels so senseless. And that brings us to the final and maybe the most haunting part of this story. How does an event this shocking just disappear? How does it become a forgotten footnote? The answer is pretty simple and pretty cynical. It was covered up, deliberately, and for a long time, very successful. 100 years, let that sink in. For a full century, the official records, the court of inquiry, all the documents that told the real story and totally contradicted the official Bolshevik narrative, they were sealed, locked away from the public. Why? Well, the goal was pretty straightforward. Protect the shiny reputation of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, and, maybe more importantly, hide the massive, catastrophic failures in leadership that actually caused the riot. And you know what? It worked. 25 of the rioters were convicted of mutiny. But the men who killed 5 Canadian soldiers, nobody was ever charged. Not a single person was held accountable. The government's story became the only story, and the truth, the soldiers' reality, was just silenced. So that brings us back to where we started, back to that gravestone. Sometime we'll understand. Well, a century has passed. The records are finally open. We know the soldiers' side of the story now. The broken promises, the horrible conditions, the whole cover-up. But as we look back on this tragic story of betrayal, you have to ask, 100 years later, do we finally understand?